He had rehearsed it twice. Once in the carriage, returning from his solicitor's offices in Lincoln's Inn, where the papers had been drawn with the particular discretion that Mr. Crawley extended to clients whose difficulties were domestic rather than commercial. And once more that morning, standing at the window of his study while the ground staff raked the gravel drive below, and the clock on the mantelpiece marked the quarter hour with a sound like a fingernail tapped against crystal. The speech was not long. He had taken care with that. Judith, his wife, the Duchess of Ravenscourt, though he found he could not think of her by that title without a faint constriction behind his ribs that he had never satisfactorily diagnosed, was not a woman who required preamble. She would want the thing stated plainly. He owed her that much. He owed her, if he was honest, considerably more. The settlement was generous. His solicitor had said so with a particular emphasis that suggested it was, in fact, more than generous, that it bordered on the penitential. A house in Bath, furnished and staffed, an income of £800 per annum, paid quarterly, independent of any claim upon the Ravenscourt estate. Her personal effects, her books, her correspondence, all hers, naturally. The Sèvres tea service she had brought from her father's house in Devonshire, which she polished herself on the first Sunday of each month with a soft cloth and a concentration that made her appear for those 20 minutes as though the rest of the world had been gently extinguished. He had noticed that. He noticed most things about her. That was, he had come to understand, the central difficulty. The door opened at 11 o'clock precisely because he had asked Mrs. Foyle to send word at 1:45, and Judith was a woman who arrived when she was expected and never a moment before. She wore a day dress of pale green muslin, high-waisted, with a narrow ribbon of darker green beneath the bodice, and her hair was drawn back in the simple arrangement she preferred for mornings when no company was expected. She carried nothing. Her hands were at her sides, and she entered the room the way she entered every room, without apology, without performance, with the quiet self-possession of a woman who understood that a closed door was not the same thing as a forbidden one. "You wish to speak with me," she said. Not a question. She had a way of removing the interrogative from sentences that might have carried one, and it unsettled him, though he could never have said precisely why. Perhaps because it suggested she already knew the answer and was merely offering him the courtesy of saying it aloud. "I did. Please. Sit." She did not sit. She remained standing near the second chair, the one closest to the window, with her fingers resting lightly on its carved back, as though reserving her position without committing to it. The morning light caught the edge of her jaw and throat and turned her skin to something he forced himself not to catalogue. He cleared his throat. He had the papers arranged on the desk before him, Mr. Crawley's work, impeccable, the clauses numbered and the margins clean, and he set his hand upon them the way a man might rest his palm on the lid of a box he was not entirely certain he wanted to open. "I have given considerable thought," he began, and already the rehearsed words felt foreign in his mouth, stiff and overstarched, like a collar that had been pressed by someone unfamiliar with the shape of the neck it was meant to fit. "To the nature of our arrangement, to the terms under which we have conducted ourselves these past 2 years, and I have concluded, that is, I have come to believe, that the honorable course—" "Duncan." His name. She used it so rarely that the sound of it stopped him as cleanly as a hand pressed to his chest. He looked at her. She was watching him with the expression he had seen her wear while reading difficult passages in the volumes she kept beside her chair in the drawing-room, attentive, patient, willing to be shown something she did not yet see. "You are releasing me," she said. He exhaled. "Yes." She held his gaze for a moment that felt, to him, like the silence between the last note of a hymn and the congregation's breath. Then she turned, not toward the door, but toward the tea service on the side table. The pot had been brought up by Mrs. Foyle at 10:30, as it was every morning, and it sat on its silver tray beside 2 cups and a sugar bowl that Judith never used because she took her tea plain and always had. She lifted the pot, poured. The stream was steady, amber, catching the light from the window in a way that made it look, briefly, like something molten. She set 1 cup on the desk beside his papers, not on them, but near enough that the saucer's edge touched the corner of Mr. Crawley's careful margins, and carried the other to the chair by the window, where she sat down. Not perched, not tentative, fully in the chair, her back against the upholstery, her ankles crossed beneath the hem of her dress with the particular precision of a woman who had been taught, at some formative age, that posture was a form of speech. She raised the cup, drank, set it down. "I know," she said. He stared at her. The papers beneath his hand felt suddenly absurd, costive, overwrought, the legal architecture of a decision she had apparently understood before he had finished making it. "You know," he repeated, "that you believe I wish to leave. Yes, I have known for some time." "How long?" "Since the autumn, when you began taking your supper in the study rather than the dining room, when you stopped asking Mrs. Foyle to set the table for two." She paused. "When you returned my volume of Cowper to the library shelf rather than leaving it on the table beside your chair, where I had placed it because I thought you might enjoy the longer poems." The Cowper. He remembered the Cowper, a small green volume, worn at the spine, that had appeared one evening on the table beside his armchair, like a letter left without explanation. He had read 3 poems, more than 3 if he was honest. He had read them all, sitting up past midnight with the fire burning low and the house silent around him. And then he had returned the book to the library because keeping it felt like accepting something he did not deserve. He had not known she had placed it there deliberately, or perhaps he had known, and that was worse. "Judith, I'm not leaving, Duncan." She said it without heat, without emphasis, without the particular sharpening of the voice that might have indicated argument. She said it the way she said most things, as a statement of observed fact, like remarking on the weather or noting that the post had arrived. "The settlement is generous," she continued. "Mr. Crawley has been thorough. I expect nothing less from him. But I did not marry you for a house in Bath and 800 a year, and I do not intend to be released from a marriage I have not asked to leave." He opened his mouth, closed it. The silence between them acquired a texture, like fabric pulled taut over a frame, and he understood with a sudden and unwelcome clarity that the conversation he had prepared for, the gracious speech, her quiet acceptance, the dignified separation of 2 people who had failed at proximity, was not the conversation he was going to have. The conversation he was going to have was the one he had spent 2 years avoiding. They had married in the late spring of 1812 in the chapel at Ravenscourt, with 40 guests and a sky that threatened rain without delivering it. She was the eldest daughter of Sir Philip Penfield, a baronet of modest means and considerable intelligence, whose estate near Barnstaple produced adequate wool and exceptional daughters, Judith being the eldest of 4, the quietest, the one whose dowry was respectable without being remarkable, and whose face, in the candlelight of the assembly room where he had first seen her, had struck him not as beautiful, but as something more dangerous, legible. A face that did not perform. A face that simply was. He had proposed within 6 weeks. She had accepted within 6 minutes, which had, at the time, seemed efficient, and which he later came to understand was not efficiency, but clarity. She had already decided before he asked whether the answer would be yes, and the asking was merely the mechanism by which the decision became visible. The first months had been tolerable. Better than tolerable. There were evenings by the fire, mornings at the breakfast table where her presence across the linen felt less like an obligation than an anchor. She ran the household with the kind of quiet authority that did not announce itself. Mrs. Foyle, who had served 3 duchesses and whose approval was granted with the reluctance of a fortress yielding a gate, deferred to her within a fortnight. The tenants liked her. She visited the cottages on the eastern boundary with baskets of provisions and came back with detailed accounts of roof repairs needed and children's ailments that required the apothecary, and she delivered these reports to Arden, the steward, with the brisk precision of a woman who understood that efficiency was a form of kindness. He had watched all of this from a distance that he told himself was respect, and that was, in truth, something far less admirable. He was afraid of her, not of her temper. She had none that he had ever witnessed, or none that took the common forms. Not of her judgment, though her judgment was exacting, and her silences, when she disagreed, carried the particular weight of a mind that had considered and declined. He was afraid of something subtler and more corrosive, the possibility that if he moved toward her, truly toward her, not the careful choreography of shared meals in adjacent chairs, but the real thing, the undefended thing, she would see what was behind the title and the estate and the carefully maintained composure, and what she would see would be insufficient. His father had been the previous duke, a man of large appetites and small attentions, who had managed the estate with competence and his family with indifference, and who had died in the winter of 1810, leaving behind a dukedom in adequate order, and a son who had spent 29 years learning, from precise and daily example, that proximity was not the same thing as presence. The old duke had occupied rooms, he had not inhabited them. Duncan had inherited the title, the lands, the seat in the House of Lords, and, this was the part no one mentioned because it did not appear in any ledger, the quiet certainty that whatever he offered would not be enough. That the gap between himself and the people nearest to him was architectural, built into the walls, and that the kindest thing he could do was not to pretend it wasn't there. And so he had retreated, gradually, with the particular stealth of a man who did not wish to be caught in the act of withdrawing. The suppers alone in the study, a letter to finish, he would tell Mrs. Foyle, and the housekeeper would nod and say nothing, and the table would be set for one. The mornings when he left the breakfast room before Judith arrived, leaving his cup half finished and the newspaper folded to an article he had not read. The evenings when he remained in the library until he heard her footsteps on the stairs and the soft click of her chamber door, and only then allowed himself to breathe. She had not complained. She had not asked for explanations. She had simply continued, managing the house, visiting the tenants, reading her Cowper and her Burney, walking the grounds in the late afternoon with a shawl drawn over her shoulders and her face turned toward the light in a way that made him, watching from the study window, feel as though he were observing something sacred through glass he was not permitted to open. He had mistaken her silence for acceptance. He understood that now, sitting in his study with the untouched tea cooling beside Mr. Crawley's documents, and his wife watching him from the chair by the window, with an expression he had never learned to read, because he had never allowed himself close enough to study it. "Why?" he said at last, and his voice sounded unfamiliar to him, stripped of its usual formality. "Would you wish to remain in a marriage to a man who has given you nothing?" She tilted her head. A fraction of an inch, no more, the movement of a bird considering a sound it had not expected. "You have given me a great deal," she said. "You have given me a house I am permitted to run as I see fit, staff who respect me, tenants who know my name, a library I could not have afforded in 3 lifetimes, and the freedom to read it without interruption. You have never raised your voice to me, never spoken to me with cruelty, never made me feel unwelcome in any room of this house except—" She paused. "Except the ones you were in." The words landed in the quiet of the study like a coin dropped into still water, and the ripples spread outward in every direction. "That," she said, "is the part I should like to discuss." He did not speak. He found he could not. The rehearsed phrases, the settlement, the arrangements, the careful language of honorable separation, had dissolved like sugar in the tea she had poured for him, and what remained was the raw and undecorated fact that his wife was sitting in his study, drinking tea from the Sèvres cup she had brought from Devonshire, and refusing to leave him with a composure that made his chest ache in a way he could not attribute to any medical cause. "I did not marry you for love," she said. "I want to be clear about that because I think you have convinced yourself otherwise, that I came to you with expectations you have failed to meet, and that the kindest thing is to return me to the life I had before. But I did not come to you with expectations. I came to you with eyes open and a disposition to make the best of what was offered. What was offered was a man who noticed things, noticed me, with a precision that most people reserve for objects they intend to keep. You knew how I took my tea before I told you. You knew which chair I preferred in the drawing room. You knew that I read in the evenings and walked in the afternoons and that I was happiest in rooms with good light. You knew all of this, and then you withdrew from every room where I might have been, and I have spent 2 years trying to understand why." She set her cup down. The saucer met the table without sound. "Ah, I believe," she said, and her voice had not risen, had not broken, had maintained the steady and unremarkable tone of a woman describing the weather or the state of the roads, "that you are afraid. Not of me. Of being seen clearly and found wanting. And I believe you decided, at some point I cannot identify, that removing yourself was less painful than risking being known." The clock on the mantelpiece marked the half-hour. The sound fell into the room and died. Duncan looked down at the papers beneath his hand, Mr. Crawley's careful clauses, the settlement that his solicitor had called generous and that his wife had called thorough, the legal architecture of a retreat disguised as an act of grace. "You are not wrong," he said. 3 words. They cost him more than anything Mr. Crawley had charged. The silence that followed was not the silence of 2 people who had run out of things to say. It was the silence of 2 people who had arrived, after 2 years and a great deal of unnecessary distance, at the beginning of a conversation they should have had on the first evening of their marriage, when the candles were lit and the house was new, and the possibility of honesty was still close enough to touch. "My father," he said, and stopped. Started again. "My father occupied this house for 31 years. He managed the estate, sat in the Lords, attended every function required of his position. And in all that time, in 3 decades of marriage to my mother, I do not believe he once asked her what she thought about anything, not the household, not the tenants, not the children. She existed at the periphery of his life, like furniture, present, accounted for, occasionally remarked upon when guests required it." He looked at her. "I told myself I would not be that man. And in trying not to be that man, I became something worse. A man who noticed everything and said nothing, who studied his wife from across rooms and corridors in the width of a breakfast table and never once—" His voice failed him. He recovered it with effort. "Never once told her what he saw." "What did you see?" Judith asked. The question was so simple, so entirely without artifice, that it undid him more thoroughly than any accusation could have. "Someone who deserved to be met," he said. "Not managed, not provided for. Met." She was quiet for a long moment. The light from the window had shifted as they spoke, moving across the floor in the slow migration of late morning toward noon, and it touched the edge of her chair now, gilding the arm and the curve of her wrist where it rested. "Then meet me," she said. "I have been here the entire time." He looked at the papers, looked at her, made a decision that no solicitor could have drafted and no settlement could have bought. He reached across the desk and moved Mr. Crawley's documents to the side, not crumpled, not destroyed, simply set aside, the way one sets aside an umbrella when the rain has stopped. He picked up the cup she had poured for him. The tea was no longer hot, but it was the temperature she always served it, the temperature he preferred, and the fact that she knew this, had always known this, was the thing that finally broke the surface of his composure. He drank. "I should like," he said, setting the cup down, "to take my supper in the dining room this evening, if you are willing." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something smaller and more private, the expression of a woman who had waited for something without certainty that it would arrive, and was now receiving it without triumph, without vindication, without anything except the quiet recognition that patience, properly applied, was its own form of courage. "I will tell Mrs. Foyle," she said. That evening the table was set for 2. Mrs. Foyle, who had watched the household's careful architecture of avoidance with the professional impassivity of a woman who had served 3 duchesses and buried her opinions beneath 30 years of impeccable service, set the candles herself. She used the good ones, beeswax, not tallow, and placed them in the silver holders that had not been brought out since the previous autumn, when the Countess of Ashwick had visited and required a formal dinner that neither the Duke nor the Duchess had enjoyed. Judith wore a gown of cream silk with a high waist and a narrow band of gold thread at the hem. She had not changed for supper in months. There had been no one to change for, but tonight she had stood before the glass in her chamber and made small adjustments with a care that was not vanity, but attention. The difference mattered. She wanted him to see that she had chosen to be here, not merely arrived. He was already at the table when she entered, standing, not seated, standing behind his chair with his hands resting on its back, as though he did not quite trust himself to sit without her permission. He wore his evening coat, properly tied, the first time she had seen him dressed for dinner in weeks, and there was something in his posture that reminded her of their first evening at Ravenscourt, when the house was still unfamiliar, and his courtesy had a quality of bewilderment that she had found, despite everything, endearing. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening," she said. They sat. Mrs. Foyle served the soup, a clear broth, well seasoned, and withdrew with the particular efficiency of a woman who understood that her absence was, on this occasion, the most valuable service she could provide. They ate in silence for several minutes. But it was a different silence, not the blank, courteous quiet of two people who had run out of things to say, but the tentative stillness of two people who had a great deal to say and were choosing, with care, where to begin. "The Eastern cottages," he said. "Arden tells me the roofing was completed last week. You oversaw the arrangements." "I did. The thatcher was adequate but required supervision. His measurements were approximate." "You supervised a thatcher?" "Through Arden. I do not stand on rooftops, Duncan." Something moved across his face, amusement or the memory of it, surfacing through layers of disuse. "No," he said. "I did not imagine you did." She looked at him across the candles and saw, for the first time in a long time, that he was looking back. Not glancing, not observing from the corner of his vision while pretending to read or to study the fire or to attend to some document that could have waited. Looking at her with the full and undivided attention of a man who had decided, this evening, this hour, over this indifferent broth, to stop retreating. "Tell me about the cowper," he said. She set her spoon down. "What about it?" "You placed it on the table beside my chair. You chose it deliberately. Why?" "Because you were reading Burke, and Burke is exhausting. Because the longer poems, the task in particular, have a quality of attention to ordinary things that I thought you might find restful. Because," she hesitated. It was the first time he had seen her hesitate since the morning, and it cost her something visible. "Because I wanted you to know that I was paying attention, that I saw what you read, and how you sat, and which fire you preferred, and what hour you retired, and that none of it was invisible to me, even if you wished it to be." The candle between them flickered. A draught from the window, or the house breathing, or something less explicable. "I returned it to the library," he said, "because keeping it felt like accepting something." "Yes, and I was not certain I had earned it." "You had not," she said, with the plainness that was her particular gift and her most effective weapon. "But that was rather the point. It was not a reward. It was an invitation." He was quiet for a long time. The soup cooled. The candles burned lower by fractions. Somewhere in the house a clock struck the hour, and neither of them looked away. "I should like," he said, "to accept, if the invitation remains open." "It has been open for 2 years, Duncan. I've simply been waiting for you to walk through it." The weeks that followed were not dramatic. There was no single grand gesture, no public declaration, no moment designed for an audience. What happened was smaller and more difficult than that. It was two people who had lived in the same house without inhabiting the same life, learning, carefully and with considerable awkwardness, to occupy the same room. He began taking breakfast in the dining room. Not every morning. There were days when old habits pressed in and the study door closed before he was fully aware of having reached for the handle. But most mornings, and she was always there, and the table was always set for 2, and Mrs. Foyle brought the tea at 8:30 with an expression of carefully suppressed satisfaction that neither of them remarked upon. He asked her questions, small ones at first, about the household accounts, the tenants, the kitchen garden she had planted in the spring that he had never mentioned, and that produced, he now learned, the herbs that flavored the dishes he had been eating for months without curiosity about their origin. She answered with the precision he had always admired and the warmth he was only now permitted to see, and he understood gradually that the two qualities were not separate, that her precision was her warmth, that the care she took with facts and arrangements and the temperature of his tea was the vocabulary in which she expressed everything she felt. He told her about the House of Lords, not the politics. She read the newspapers and needed no instruction, but the texture of it, the particular quality of the light in the chamber on winter afternoons, the way certain peers spoke as though addressing the century rather than the room, the tedium of procedural debate and the rare, electric moments when something genuine broke through the rhetoric. She listened with the attention she gave to everything, complete, unhurried, occasionally interrupted by a question so precise that it rearranged his understanding of the subject he had just described. They walked the grounds together. Not every afternoon. She still walked alone some days, and he understood that the solitude was not a rejection, but a need, and that respecting it was part of what she had asked him to learn. But on the days they walked together, their conversation found a rhythm that felt, to both of them, like something recovered rather than invented, familiar in the way that a path through a wood is familiar, even when one has not walked it in years. The cowper reappeared on the table beside his chair. He did not return it. One morning, when Judith had gone to the village with a list of provisions for the Michaelmas distribution, and Arden was occupied with a boundary dispute on the southern tenant farms, Duncan found himself alone in the breakfast room for the first time in weeks. Mrs. Foyle came to clear the plates, and he watched her work. The practiced economy of her movements, the way she stacked the china without sound, the decades of service encoded in the angle of her wrist. "Mrs. Foyle," she paused. "Your Grace, you have served this household a long time. 31 years, Your Grace, under your father and under you." He looked at the table. 2 settings, 2 cups, the small vase of lavender that Judith had begun placing at the center each morning, cut from the garden she had planted without asking permission, and tended through the steward without seeking praise. "Did my father ever take breakfast with my mother?" Mrs. Foyle held the plates against her apron. Her expression did not change. It was not the kind of face that changed, but something shifted behind her eyes, the way light shifts behind a curtain when the wind moves without entering the room. "In the early years, Your Grace, before you were born. After that, he preferred the study." "And she?" "She preferred the breakfast room. She sat where Her Grace sits now, same chair, same window." Mrs. Foyle lifted the tray. "If I may say, Your Grace, the table looks better with 2 settings. It always did." She left before he could respond, which was, he suspected, deliberate. On a Thursday evening in late autumn, after a supper during which they had discussed the new plantings along the south border and disagreed, with considerable enjoyment, about the merits of lavender versus rosemary for the kitchen beds, he paused at the foot of the staircase as she started up. "Judith?" She turned. The candlelight from the hall caught her face, and he saw her as he had seen her on the first evening, not beautiful in the way that word was commonly used, but legible, open, entirely herself. "Fanny, thank you," he said, "for not leaving." She regarded him from the third stair with an expression that contained, he thought, everything she had carried for 2 years without complaint: the patience, the loneliness, the stubborn and unrewarded faith that the man she had married was not the man she had lived with, and that the distance between the two could be crossed if only one of them was willing to stand still long enough for the other to arrive. "You are welcome," she said, "though I should point out that I told you I was not going to, and I generally mean what I say." "Yes," he said, "I am learning that." She continued up the stairs. He stood in the hall for a moment, listening to her footsteps, and then he followed. Mr. Crawley's documents remained in the desk drawer for the better part of a year. Duncan found them one morning while searching for a letter from Arden regarding the new drainage on the northern fields, and he stood for a moment with the settlement papers in his hand, reading the clauses that described the terms under which his wife would have been removed from his life with all the order and precision that the law could provide. He carried them to the fire, watched them catch and curl. The paper blackened at the edges first, then the center, and the careful numbering of Mr. Crawley's clauses disappeared into ash with a sound like a whispered word. He did not tell Judith. She found the ash herself later that afternoon when she came to place a new volume on the table beside his chair. Not Cowper this time, but Crabbe, whose verses about parish life she thought he would find unexpectedly moving. She saw the residue in the grate, and she saw the empty space in the drawer he had left open, and she understood without being told what had been burned and why. She placed the Crabbe on the table. She adjusted it slightly, a 1/4 inch to the left so that it would be the first thing his hand found when he reached out from his chair. Then she left the room without a word, because some things did not require language, and the absence of a document was its own declaration. By the following spring, the household had reorganized itself around a pattern that Mrs. Foyle described to the cook in the privacy of the kitchen as how it should have been from the beginning, and I will thank you not to remark upon it. The table was set for 2 at every meal. The study door remained open. The drawing room in the evenings held 2 chairs drawn close to the fire, 2 books, 2 cups, and a silence that was no longer empty but inhabited, the shared quiet of 2 people who had learned that presence was not performance, and that the most difficult thing a person could do was not to speak but to remain. Their son arrived the following winter, a boy with his mother's steady gaze and his father's habit of watching things carefully before committing to them. They named him Philip for her father, and Duncan held him for the first time in the drawing room, beside the fire, in the chair where the cowper had once appeared, and understood with a clarity that required no rehearsal and no revision that the settlement he had nearly offered his wife was not generosity, but cowardice, and that the only honorable thing he had ever done was fail to send it. Sir Philip Penfield visited that spring. He walked the grounds with his daughter, admired the kitchen garden, pronounced the roofing on the eastern cottages adequate, and held his grandson on the terrace with the careful grip of a man who had raised 4 daughters and was now encountering the bewildering novelty of a boy. He sat at dinner beside a son-in-law who asked him, with genuine interest, about the wool yields in North Devon and the particular challenges of drainage on sloped pasture land, and who listened to the answers with the attentiveness of a man who had recently learned, at some cost, the difference between hearing and attending. Sir Philip ate well, drank moderately, and retired early, and in the morning he told his daughter over breakfast that she appeared to be precisely where she ought to be. She said nothing. She poured his tea, and when her father had gone upstairs to pack his trunk, she sat for a moment in the chair by the window, her chair, the one she had claimed on her first morning in this house and never relinquished, and looked out at the grounds she had learned to love, not because they were grand, but because they were hers, and because the man who owned them had finally understood that ownership and presence were not the same thing, and that the latter was worth infinitely more than the former. Years later, long after the study had become a room they shared, his papers on the left side of the desk, her correspondence on the right, the arrangement so natural that visitors assumed it had always been thus, Duncan would sometimes think about the morning she had refused to leave. Not the speech he had prepared, which he could no longer remember in its particulars, not the settlement, which existed now only as ash in a grate long since cleaned, but the sound of the teapot and the steadiness of her hand, and the 2 words she had offered in place of every argument he had expected. I know, she had known, she had always known, and she had stayed anyway, not because she lacked the means to leave or the pride to demand better, but because she had looked at him, clearly, without illusion, without the particular mercy of ignorance, and decided that the man who hid was worth the patience required to find him. He kept the cowper on the table beside his chair for the rest of his life. He never returned it to the library again. They arrive here, like a book left where someone will find it whenever they are ready.